Hey, AP students, I hope that y'all are having a great weekend. If not, well, here's a Brit lecture recorded for you again, and hopefully this will make your day a little bit better. So let's just go ahead and hit this right off the bat. So we are going to be starting on slide 14, where we left off in the original video. So Charlie Wilson would lead the charge for the Russian Afghanistan conflict. And so this is indicative of the Cold War, where we had nuclear standoff and Third World rivalry. So what did that look like between the United States and Russia? So let's take a look. So we have a really big fear of what is called MAD, and that is an acronym for Mutually Assured Destruction. And the idea was that whoever struck first didn't matter. It was that once the first nuclear bomb goes off, then all of them are going to go off. And so the United States enjoyed nuclear supremacy for 4 years, from 1945 to 1949. So what changed? In 1949, the USSR would achieve the atom bomb. They would set off one and test it in the Soviet Union, and they would report this to the United Nations. Now, I have two videos here of the top one demonstrates the destructive power of the atom bomb, while the bottom one is the Russian ambassador announcing to the world that they do have the atom bomb. But risking my screen freezing again, I'm not going to play these. And so this started a arms race between the United States and Russia, that by the mid 1960s, the United States had over 31,000 warheads that were nuclear based, and the USSR would pass us up with 40,000. And the largest atom bomb that was ever detonated was by the Soviet Union, and this would be called the Tsar bomb. And the Tsar bomb, if I remember correctly, was roughly 1,000 times more powerful than Hiroshima. That the blast, the mushroom cloud, went over 40 miles into the atmosphere. People roughly, I think it said either 50 or 100 miles away, would suffer third-degree burns. It was so hot. The explosion was so hot when it went out. That signaled and proved, and the Russians would announce that there was potentially unlimited destruction with an atom bomb. And it signaled out to the United States and the rest of the world that we need to have a reduction of arms. And we would eventually enter into agreements with Russia that we would call SALT 1, 2, and 3, and START. That those were acronyms for strategic arm reduction treaties or strategic arm limitations treaties. So that's what SALT and START would stand for. Now, during the 1960s, we get the height of fear of MAD. So what would that be? That would be the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so before we talk about that, that just shows you how deep the idea of MAD got into society. And many of your parents and your grandparents would remember this. So ask them about this fear of MAD with the Russians, that in schools we would have children do drills of if the bomb went off. And if the bomb went off, the idea was duck and cover. And so you see with this picture in the top left of children hiding under their desk. Some of y'all have told me of you recall doing this if an earthquake happens or a hurricane happens. I remember doing this in Japan, of hiding under your desk if an earthquake hit. But if y'all have the opportunity, go ahead and ask your parents and your grandparents of what it was like growing up with the threat of the idea that an atom bomb could go off in your city. And so this was a book that was actually published out, that we all think of the 1950s and 1940s of the fedora hats, and why did those go out of style? Because they were really awesome hats. Well, one of the things was that it was put out there that if you bent down the brim of your hat when the bomb went off, it would protect you from the flash, which that if you did look at the flash, it would cause you to go blind, but it would also protect parts of your face from the heat. That you would be able to at least have part of your face not melted off. Now, whether these tactics were effective, thank God we never found out. And so, we also in schools, like if you look in this top right picture, would have fallout shelters that help protect students if the bomb happened while they were in school. The school that my dad works at, Ray High School in Corpus Christi, is so old that it still has a fallout shelter, and it so happens to be adjacent to his ROTC building. How convenient is that? And so the Cuban Missile Crisis would be triggered with a arms race that the United States and the USSR would enter into a competition of not just political influence, but who could launch their bombs better. And so the United States was actually leading this for a very long time, that we would get the first ballistic missile submarine, and we would name it the USS George Washington, and the George Washington would sail in 1959, and in the hull of the submarine would be nuclear missiles. And this was very frightening because the submarine, from its inception in World War I to today, the submarine is probably one of the most frightening weapons that mankind has ever made. This near undetectable machine underwater that, unless you so happen to hit it with sonar, you would never know it was there. So the idea that a submarine could carry a nuclear bomb would just further the idea of mad. Now, the Russians would attempt to make their own nuclear submarine called the K-19, and it was a disaster. The K-19 was so rapidly built that it had many flaws in it. But the Soviet Union decided that they were not going to be outdone by the Americans. So they launched the K-19 haphazardly, and its nuclear reactor would melt down, and it nearly exploded. And luckily, due to the bravery of the men on that vessel, many of them would die due to radiation sickness trying to stop it, would prevent the K-19 from exploding. If you want to watch a great movie on that with Liam Neeson and Harrison Ford, it's called K-19 Widowmaker. Again, that's a rated R film. I'm pretty sure it's rated R. You're going to have to ask your parents for permission, but it is a great film that demonstrates the bravery of these men to stop World War III from happening, essentially. Now, the Soviets would respond with, well, it's not really a response, they had this first, with the R-7 Semyorka missile. That's what launched Sputnik into space. So that's the ICBM, and that's an acronym for Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. Another fearsome weapon that could kill from thousands of miles away. The United States would also create the US MGR-1 Honest John missile in 1953. This was the first surface-to-air missile. This was you being able to transport this missile in a vehicle to be able to launch to its target. And so this was the first real mobile missile system. And then the United States tops it all off with the Northrop Grumman B-2 Spirit stealth aircraft, this extremely dangerous aircraft. It's the most fearsome aircraft on the planet, that it has stealth technology to where it's nearly undetectable by radar. It flies so high you're not able to see it, and it can fly with 40,000 pounds of armament, if I remember correctly, for 6 hours without being refueled. And it's earned a saying that if you see it, you're not the target. It is that scary. And so both countries would get very fearful of one another and extremely suspicious. And so the United States makes a move that arguably triggers the Cuban Missile Crisis. Your book doesn't talk about this, and that kind of irritates me. Of that, you can make the argument that the United States made this happen, but perhaps it might have been an overreaction from Moscow. So we'll see. So in 1961, the United States with NATO would deploy U.S.-made Jupiter missiles, and that's what I have in the top right corner there. They would give this to Turkey and Italy to serve as deterrents against the USSR. Now, the USSR would perceive this as a aggressive move, because the position of these missiles were well within range of Moscow, the capital of the Soviet Union. And so they viewed this as an aggressive move, not a defensive move. And so their response was to approach Cuba, and Cuba was under the control of the Castro regime. So you can see the picture there of Nikita Khrushchev, the general secretary of the Soviet Union, hugging on Fidel Castro, the dictator of Cuba. And they enter into a secret agreement to allow the Soviet Union to bring in ballistic missiles, aircraft, and other weapons to Cuba. Now, if y'all don't know this, Havana, if I remember correctly, is about 90 miles away from Florida. That's how close Cuba is to the United States. So when the United States discovered this by using our spy airplane, the U-2 by Lockheed Martin, the nation was aghast. We were immediately fearful of the fact that the Russians had missiles that could reach almost the entire continental United States. But it not just threatened us, it threatened Mexico, all of Central America, and most of South America. So this was a threat to the entire Western Hemisphere. Immediately, President Kennedy would take action to address this with the Soviet Union, and he would use what was called the red phone. This was not a literal red phone. It's often depicted that way in movies, but it actually didn't exist. We called it the red phone because it was a direct communication with Soviet Russia. That it was actually at the Pentagon, and it was not even a phone. It was more like a fax machine. But we would communicate with the Soviet Union immediately. The Kennedy administration would launch a naval blockade around the entire island of Cuba, and then he would also expand a embargo that was originally instituted by President Eisenhower to stop Cuba from expanding. And we've had that embargo last even to today. It has weakened over time. The President Obama administration weakened that embargo not too long ago, and now Americans can travel to Cuba to your own peril. I wouldn't suggest it. Now, Kennedy and the leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, would agree to remove the respective missiles. That Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba, and the United States did not publicly say this, but we agreed to remove the missiles from Turkey. And so this would help ease tensions between the superpowers, but this just demonstrated how fearful we were of the idea of MAD. And I included a speech from President Kennedy announcing to the nation the Cuban Missile Crisis. Y'all may watch that if you want to. If I recall, it's 18 minutes long, so that's up to you. The big thing with, and I need to make this point here, that the Cuban Missile Crisis proved that regardless of the size of your nation, regardless of your economy, regardless of your strength perceived by the world, real or not real, the atom bomb made you a player. The atom bomb earned you a seat at the table of power. And this does become relevant to today. Just think about Iran today. They're actively trying to get a nuclear weapon. They claim that they're not, but all the evidence and intelligence that we have points to that they are making a nuclear bomb. And geopolitically speaking, it's so that they can elbow their way to the table to be able to speak freely with the United States and the rest of the free world. Let's just hope that they never actually get an atomic weapon. And so the Cold War and the superpowers would spread their influence across the world. And so this is where we get what's called the third world of nations that would not actively participate in the Cold War, but we would compete for influence over those areas. And so the United States policy of containment would largely appear to have failed. That we would lose China to communism, Vietnam to communism, Laos, Cambodia, Cuba, many African nations, and South American nations such as Venezuela, Colombia, and others. And so it would appear that the United States is losing the Cold War in terms of influence. But in terms of what the United States is actually gaining, the United States is actually gaining a lot more ground. That our military surpasses over 1 million service members, and that these 1 million service members are spread across the globe in military bases. So I included a map of 1989 of our global military influence. And so we're the only nation on the planet that does this, by the way. No other nation publicly has military bases like this. Now, Russia today does have a military base in Syria, and they've got a little sliver in Europe that they still hold on to, but it's nowhere to the scale of the United States. And China is actively trying to build a naval base in Africa, but we're going to see how that plays out for them. Now, China does have secret operations across the world, including in the United States. We're actually cracking down on this right now. Thank you, FBI, that they're finding these secret police stations that China has been running. Let's get back to the Cold War. So the United States is outpacing Russia with military influence across the world. We also have mutual defense treaties with 42 nations participating in 4 regionally based alliances like NATO and others. We are also the host nation of the United Nations. We have the United Nations in New York City, so we actively have that influence just being on our soil. And we are also pouring billions of dollars in aid for military and humanitarian causes across 100 nations. And the Soviet Union is falling behind in this. The Soviet Union cannot keep up with our capitalist spending across the globe. And so this massively helps the United States be able to outpace the Soviet system and shows the cracks in the Soviet system. And we see this, that the heavy-handed nature of the Soviets is beginning to show that Union members in Eastern Europe are starting to grow very tired of the Soviet system. They're growing very tired of the Soviets having such a large play in their systems. And so we can see this in Yugoslavia, that Yugoslavia actually begins to depart from the Soviet system and starts making their own form of communism. Now, Stalin did not like this. Why? Because Stalin viewed this as showing weakness of the Soviet system. And he would more than, I think it's over 100 times, attempt to get the leader of Yugoslavia, Joseph Tito, assassinated. And Tito fires back with one letter to Stalin, that this letter says, if you do not stop sending assassins to us, to which we've caught several, and he actually lists out all of them in the letter, he says, I will send one assassin to you, and that's all that I will need. And so he actually threatens Stalin, and Stalin actually backs off. But this spreads, this idea of leaving the Soviet Union spreads to the other bloc countries like Hungary, like Czechoslovakia, and others. And there's actually, I include a video here of the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 against Budapest. Now, that's 3 years after Stalin has died. And that's largely, more than likely, the reason why they chose to start rebelling during that time. But the Soviet Union continues to crush rebellions like in Czechoslovakia, like in Hungary. Now, not only was the USSR influence in Eastern Europe waning, but China was beginning to lose its interest in Russia as well. And so Russia starts to stop its support with China. And one of the things that they do is that they turn their back against China by withdrawing a lot of their scientists, helping the Chinese develop a nuclear warhead. And this comes to a head in 1969, that there's actually almost a war between Russia and China called the Sino-Soviet border conflict, that they started fighting over this border in northern China. And eventually, the Soviet Union and China works this out. But this opened the door for the United States. And the United States hopped on this opportunity immediately. And this is what actually begins to open relationships between the United States and China. And this was a big black eye for the Soviet Union, losing China and the United States getting more influence in China. And so we start getting the idea of democracy spreading. And so we get more freedom, the struggle for independence spreading across the world after World War II. And so other countries start wanting to get independence from their colonial overlords. And this spreads like wildfire after World War II, that from the 1940s to the early 1990s, this is where we get a process of decolonization. That after World War II, colonies started to question their overlords of, okay, you fought for self-determination, you fought for democracy, you fought for freedom against the Nazis, the fascist Italians, and against imperialist Japan. So why are you so practicing colonization? Now that's a tough question to ask. And so these countries slowly, over time, begin to loosen up colonization, primarily England. England really loosens up and keeps its promise with India and other countries across the world to give them independence. And so the United States would grant independence for the Philippines in 1946. And ironically enough, they choose July 4th. July 4th, 1946. The Philippines actually greatly admired, for the most part, the American system. And so they chose that auspicious date. And none other than Douglas MacArthur would help celebrate Filipino independence, July 4th, 1946. And England would let go of a lot of its colonies, like India. Pakistan was not really a colony of England, it was more part of India, and we're going to talk about that more in just a moment. Burma, also known as Myanmar, Jordan, Israel eventually, and we'll talk about Israel in just a moment. And so the decades that follow, we would see a rapid rise of decolonization. But a lot of issues would come out of that, and we'll talk about that shortly. So what would lead to the process of decolonization? Well, one would be the great falls of empires of World War One. The Ottoman Empire failing, the Russian Empire failing, and the Austria-Hungary German Empire failing. And then World War II, just the fact that people were fighting for freedom and democracy and the idea of self-determination would spread across the world. This idea that you, the people, should be the ones who are leading your government. And so the idea of democracy and Enlightenment thought would spread. And also Christianity would play a part in this. That Christianity, with the education systems that it would bring, would spread. That as people would study Christianity and study the education systems of the West, they would point out the hypocrisy of these colonizers. Of like, how is it that you're teaching us about freedom, democracy, and self-determination, but you won't let us have that? And so a lot of the colonizers would be their own undoing. And then also there was just the resentment of the treatment of people by colonizers. And also the idea of nationalism. So much of the Western world had seen decolonization as a foregone conclusion, as a fait accompli, that it was just something that's already happening. And for the most part, there was a peaceful transfer, but there were some struggles of power. And so we're going to take a look at like where these struggles of power would come from. And one of those is like in Israel. I have a video here where violence would really spring up in the conflict of Israel. So India is a really good example of the conflict for power, that as the colonizers left, we have this vacuum of power of who's going to be in charge. And this was not without conflict, because all sorts of power struggle would happen of which ethnicity would be in charge, which religion would be in charge, what system is going to be in place, not only with just religion, like which system of the religion would be in charge, because there was varying degrees of like, let's say for India, which version of Hinduism was going to be in charge. And the question also raised of should Hinduism even be in charge? And so we would get two systems put into place with India. We would have the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League. Now, the Indian National Congress would be led by Mohandas Gandhi, pictured here on the right, and the Muslim League would be led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah. And these were both Indians, but India had a pretty sizable Muslim community. They were the minority, but they were sizable in northern India. If y'all are really thinking and making connections here, you're going back to the Mughal Empire, Remember, the Mughal Empire was run by the Muslims, and so they were mainly concentrated in northern India. So we're seeing the lasting legacy of the Mughal spring up here. Now, Gandhi was a bit more progressive compared to his other Hindu counterparts, that he embraced a more secular state, that he believed that all religions should be embraced, women should get more rights, and also abolish the caste system. But the great weakness of Gandhi was that he rejected industrialization, that he believed that industrialization and capitalism would destroy the moral values of India and cause more harm than good. Now, to contrast him, we would get Nehru. Nehru embraced industrialization, and he also wanted India to be for Hindus. This greatly disturbed the Muslim League, that they thought that they would be abused by the Hindu majority, and so the idea of a Hindu nation worried a lot of Muslim minorities, and they thought that they would get abused by the Indian National Congress. And to them, this was confirmed with the protection of cows from slaughter and just wanting to name India Ban Maharam, which translates to Mother India. So this was also a Hindu-based idea, a Hindu-centric idea for India. Now, if some of y'all are wondering, okay, what's the issue with protecting cows? That was the main source of meat for many Muslims. That they did not have very many avenues for meat with all their dietary restrictions with Sharia law, most certainly not pigs. And so, what was the solution that India came up with? Well, the Indian National Congress would finally put forward the idea of what was called Partition of India. And the Partition of India was create two separate countries. Create India for Hindus and create a separate nation for Muslims. And this would create Pakistan. And that translates to Pure Land or Holy Land, Pakistan. And this immediately sparked conflicts. This created riots all across India. In Calcutta alone, 2,000 Hindus would be killed, and many Muslims would be killed. And so eventually we would get a great migration across India, that over 1 million Muslims would immediately start crossing India into modern day Pakistan. And Gandhi would respond with this of a call for nonviolence. And he believed in nonviolence. He did not believe in confrontation. He was a champion for nonviolence, of that you should have protests but not have any threat of violence whatsoever. Now, unfortunately for him, people did not really agree with that, and it would result in his assassination. A Hindu extremist would actually shoot him, and he would die to his injuries. Now, similarly to India, we get the Palestine-Israel conflict. That this was very similar to India in many different ways, but also different in a lot of different ways, and we still see that today. And so let's give a brief history of the Palestine-Israel conflict. So we could go back literally 3,000 years on this. That even just the name of either Palestine or Israel is already a point of contention of like, what is the original name of this region? And you can literally go all the way back to the Egyptians. And there's many different arguments of what it was called, because even according to the Bible and the Torah, the name Israel was not the original name of that region. It was originally called Judea at one point when it was under the control of the Romans. It was actually called Philistina. When the Philistines inhabited that land, it was called Canaan. When the Canaanites inhabited that land in the days of Abraham, and Egypt would call it Philistina. It would call it different names because of the Philistines. And there's actually this point of contention around this stone, that this stone actually has Israel on there. But the way that the hieroglyphics are carved on there, and this stone predates everything. It predates the Torah, it predates not the Torah, predates a lot of modern a lot of modern historically accepted sources outside of the Bible and the Torah. That's probably the best way of saying that. And we look to the Egyptians, and there is this stone that has Israel's name on there from about 1200 BC. No, it was 1500 BC or so, and all the names that fall afterwards are younger. The actual title Palestine wouldn't even come about until Herodotus. That Herodotus is the one who first starts calling it Palestine, but he called it Palestine, Syria. Eventually, the Roman Emperor Hadrian would name the region Syria Palestina, which is where we get the modern name of Palestine. So just that alone has got a lot of conflicts behind it. I know many of y'all are going, stop yapping, Mr. Britt, on this, but I just want to demonstrate that this isn't as cut and dry as many people want to make it. Just the name alone is bringing in a lot of conflict. Now let's talk about the control of the land. So in 1917, the British government would announce what's called the Balfour Declaration, and I have that on the top right of your screen here. That the Balfour Declaration was put forward by Lord Balfour, that he would state that the crown government of Britain would help establish a homeland for the Jews. And this was surrounded around a Christian and Jewish view of history, of actually using the Bible and the Torah as a historical record, which many historians have different arguments on this of like, is the Bible and the Torah a historical record or not? But we are getting increased archaeological evidence to support that the Bible is a historical, along with a religious document, a collection of religious documents. We're getting more and more evidence to show that the Bible does show historically accurate events in the Old Testament when you look at beyond the Torah into the histories of like First and Second Kings, Numbers, and other books in the Bible, the Book of Judges as well. And so the League of Nations would place the region under the control of the British, and we called this the British Mandate. And the British Mandate would be transferred over to the United Nations. Now, the British wanted to get out of controlling this region, especially after World War II, with the idea of self-determination becoming more and more popular. So in 1947, the UN announced Resolution 181, and much like India would announce a partition. And they wanted to partition the region into two states, a Jewish state and an Arab or Muslim state. And Jerusalem would be shared as an international city, that it wouldn't be under the control of the Jewish state, and it wouldn't be under control of the Arab/Muslim state. And the resolution outlined what both states had to accept. And one of those was this: guaranteeing to all persons equal and non-discriminatory rights in civil, political, economic, and religious matters, and the enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms, including freedoms of religion, language, speech, publication, education, assembly, and association. And this was to be extended to both men and women. Now, the Jewish Council or Zionist Council would celebrate this order, while the Arab League would reject it. I'll explain what Zionist actually means here in just a moment, because some of y'all are probably going, I've heard this word before. I don't know what it means, and it seems to have a kind of like a dirty name to it, especially if you go to social media, especially TikTok. I know some of y'all are going to roll your eyes on this one, but Lord, TikTok has really allowed just one side of this argument to spread on its platform. The question is as to why, and I'm not going to get into that. The Arab League immediately would reject this. And the Arab League was being led by General Secretary Azam Pasha, and he stated in an Egyptian newspaper that he says, quote, that he hopes, quote, the Jews do not force us into a war. Later on, he says, we will sweep them, the Jews, into the sea, unquote. And this is the beginning of this phrase that some of y'all may have heard on social media, on the news, of river to sea, Palestine will be free. And it's talking about from the Jordan River, which is the eastern border of Israel, modern day Israel, all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, basically saying to wipe out Israel as a state or a country. Now, depending on your political views or your religious views, that can be an anti-Semitic statement. I'm not going to say as a teacher whether it is or not, but you can make the determination of that you have a group of people saying that the Jewish state should not exist. So you can determine whether you think that's anti-Semitic or not. So what is Zionism? What exactly is that? Zionism is the idea that the Jews should have their homeland, which is present-day Israel, as their state. That's the idea of Zionism, that the Jews should have a homeland. They should have their own state. That's the idea of Zionism. Now, other people are going to say it's other things, that it's a ethnically based idea, aka a racist based idea, or a religiously based idea. I think that argument's a bit more safe. But we're not going to get into that because I could be on this slide for literally hours upon hours upon hours, and we're not going to do that. Just to give you an idea of how much vitriol there was around this idea of UN order or UN Resolution 181, Syrian President Sakuri al-Kawati, he would state outright, "We will eliminate Zionism," and I will go as far as to say that that is a anti-Semitic statement. And so, the Balfour Declaration was announced in 1917. 1 year after that, Jews would go out celebrating in the streets of celebrating the British commitment to the Jewish Foundation. And the Muslim Christian Association 1918 would come out with this statement. I'll allow you all to read that if you want to. And so the struggle for independence with Israel would come to a head on May 15th, 1948. The British mandate would expire on that day, and it would actually expire exactly at midnight. And the British weren't playing around. The moment the stroke of midnight hit, troops would start leaving. At that time, that region was called Palestine, so they would be leaving Palestine. The Jewish Council, anticipating this expiration, because it wasn't a secret, the British announced that they were leaving on May 15th, 1948. They would come out with the Declaration of the Establishment of the State of Israel. That's their Declaration of Independence, if you want to draw a parallel there. And the Declaration actually outlined all of the mandates stated in UN Resolution 181, that they guaranteed freedom of religion, freedom of protest, everything in there. And it actually even left it even more open of saying that they are 100% open to the idea of a two-state solution. The Arab League immediately would take action in war. That the Arab League was a coalition of Arab nations. This would be Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon. Trying to remember who else is involved. I know those states are involved, so we'll stop there. And they immediately declare war on the fresh nation of Israel. And so Israel goes to war, and in 1949, an armistice is signed. And so this is not a treaty that ended the war, it just stopped the fighting. And it set boundaries for Israel. And if you look on this map on the right, it's that kind of like darkish blue. I don't know what you would call that, ocean blue, I suppose. And the bright green was reserved for Arabs and Muslims. That is the present-day Gaza, the West Bank, and Golan Heights. And Israel allowed these borders to stay. They were actually called the Green Line. That's what it was called back then. This agreement would stand until 1967, where this is what we call the Six-Day War. Now, Egypt and the surrounding Arab nations would take action based on a false report from the USSR that Israel was going to expand its borders. That was not true. The Soviet Union sent this lie to Egypt, and Egypt was in charge of Nasser during this time. And Nasser was taking actions against the United Nations, against the United States. He would nationalize the Suez Canal. We call that the Suez Canal crisis. And so he was just very paranoid of the world. And when he got this notice from the Soviet Union, he took actions against Israel by placing huge amounts of infantry members on the border of Israel and Egypt, along with tanks and the entire Air Force of Egypt. Saudi Arabia would take similar measures, so would Jordan, so would Lebanon. And so Israel feels that they're about to be attacked. Israel feels that they're about to go to war with all of these Arab nations again. And so, to prevent this, and we still have huge arguments whether this was correct or not, y'all can ask this question later if you want. Israel takes preemptive action. Before Egypt fires a single shot, before a single Egyptian tank comes through, before a single Egyptian plane takes off, Israel strikes with their air force, and they bomb the entire Egyptian air force out of commission. They take out the entire Egyptian air force. They also start striking the tanks with Israeli tanks, and this is what actually starts the 6-day war. And it is a 6-day war. It only lasts for 6 days, and Israel, despite being smaller and less equipped, wins this war against Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, and I think Syria was involved in this as well. And so they eventually expand their borders, and I mean, it almost seems like the Soviets were right, but this is not the order of events that happen. Israel would claim the entire Sinai Peninsula. That's that bright green, I suppose. I don't know what exactly that color is. I'm going to say it's green. All the bright green area on this map is what Israel would claim for victory. That it would claim the entire Sinai region of Egypt, Gaza, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. Now, this is not the last conflict that Israel would fight. We get another conflict in the 1970s, and now we're having the conflict today. Israel eventually gives back these lands, by the way. Israel eventually gives Egypt back the Sinai Peninsula. Israel would give the Palestinian Authority, which is the governing body of the Palestinians, would give them Gaza, would give them West Bank, I believe the Golan Heights as well. But Israel would erect these walls, these big giant walls around Gaza and the West Bank in an attempt to protect its border. And they're pretty menacing when you see them. So this is just a brief explanation of what's going on in Israel. This is just the beginning of it. I don't foresee us seeing an end to this anytime soon. And so we get the end of communism. Good riddance. A little bit of my bias coming through there, but I'm not sure if y'all can tell. I don't like communism, so I'm going to say this is a celebration. But celebration with caution. So Mao dies in 1976. And with Mao Zedong's death comes the death of his extremely rigid style of communism. And so the CCP would move away from socialism. That they still claim to be communists, but they actually move away from socialism, but they would keep the top-down authority single-party system. Now, Mao Zedong would be replaced with Deng... Let me make sure that I say his last name correctly. Pretty sure I know how to say it. Xi Xiaoping. I believe that's how it's pronounced. There's a pronunciation guide in your book. Yeah, Deng Xiaoping. That... Xi Jinping, he would become what's known as the paramount leader. That was the title of the leader of the Communist Party. Your book doesn't explain that, and that annoys me. The paramount leader is the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, and he would immediately start taking actions to be able to address the issues that was facing China. China was lagging behind, along with the Soviet Union, behind the United States and the Western world. That the Western world's economies were excelling while the Soviet Union's and China's was stagnating. And so what Xi Jinping would do is that he would actually open up China to foreign investment. He would loosen up control over the economy and actually, by all intents and purposes, allow capitalism to enter into China. And so with capitalism opening up in China, China's economy excels. We actually kind of call it the Chinese miracle, because China's economy since the 1970s has grown to be the second largest economy in the world. Now, the United States far outpaces China. There are some people, and I would say misguidedly, says that China will one day pass us up. I seriously doubt that, but that's not the case. We're not going to talk about that right now. But the CCP loosens controls over the economy. Now, they still technically, according to their system, has total control of the economy, but they have allowed companies to run themselves in a capitalist manner. And so Xiao Xiaoping would abandon the collective farming model and embrace private ownership. And the farmers would embrace this immediately. Food production goes through the roof for China. We get increased industrialization, but it's primarily in the cities. Mao Zedong is rolling in his grave. Capitalism has entered China for the betterment of the Chinese people. So economically speaking, China gets better. Politically speaking, it gets worse. So while capitalism is spreading in China, so is corruption, pollution, crime, and the idea of democracy. Capitalism isn't always good. I know, shocker, someone sent in the black helicopters after Mr. Britt. But, there are some pains with capitalism. Corruption is one of them. And, crime as well. People get greedy and they decide to skirt the law and they make their money. I'm not encouraging that in any way. So in 1989, this really comes to a head. 1989 shows the world that the CCP is still very powerful. Now, China would begin to culturally rebel against the CCP, that they're embracing more ideas of democracy, of freedom, of liberation, and the CCP slams the door in their face. On July 4th, 1989, we get the Tiananmen Square massacre. And this is where the CCP would send in tanks, the military, and other armed vehicles and just mow down the protesters. And these protesters were primarily high school and university students. Yes, my dear students, they were people like you. They were students as young as you in the streets of Beijing protesting against the Communist Party. And what was the Communist Party's response? Machine guns. They would open fire on their own people with machine guns and run people over with tanks. That is not a exaggeration. Now, we do not know the actual numbers of this. The Communist Party has censored these numbers. In fact, this is censored in China. If you go to China, like this bottom right video here, and you go around and ask people about Tiananmen Square, if you ask them about June 4th, 1989, they will deny that they have any knowledge of it. It's actually an ongoing joke that on July 4th, 1989 in China, nothing happened. Nothing happened. And I got a little taste of this, no joke, that when I taught about this in my government class at my old school, I had Chinese students there. And I told my school, I gave them a heads up. I talked to the principal and the headmaster that I said, look, I know the school gets a lot of money from Chinese students coming here to get an education, but that's what I'm going to give them. And I need you to be okay. I'm not asking for permission. I'm giving you a warning. I had a lot of sway at my old school. I give them a warning that I will be teaching this and I need you to be okay with it. If not, I'll leave over this. I was not joking. And so I taught about Tiananmen Square and I showed the top right video of Tank Man. And this was, we don't know who this guy is. He stood in front of a tank. There was actually 18 tanks there. And he stopped them by just standing there. And you see him holding his groceries. This guy was on his way home. And he stood in front of this tank and stopped them. And he actually climbs on the tank and he knocks on it. And the men inside open it. We don't know what he says to them. We don't know what happened to him. People come in and they bring him into the crowd, and I'm sure the CCP found him at some point. Who knows? We really don't know what happened to the man. But in China, this is not taught. In China, July 4th, 1989, nothing happened. And that was what was told to me by one of my Chinese students. That I talked about this, and he literally said nothing happened. Because that is what he's taught. And he went by the name Charlie. That wasn't his actual name. But I said, Charlie, this actually happened. If you look in the background, you see the hall of people there. It is Beijing. And he said, no, this is in North Korea. These are North Korean tanks. And I quipped to him, which got him very upset. I said, "Well, where did North Korea get their tanks? China." And he got very mad about that, but the truth hurts. You hate me because I told you the truth. Um, Back then, I would quote the Bible. That's from Galatians chapter 4. So, anyways, we really don't know what the death count is. We estimate it's between 300 to 3,000, but we're never really going to know. Now, not only is China experiencing changes, and by all accounts to the benefit of China, the Soviet Union collapses. The Soviet Union faces the exact same problems as China, but because they did not take the same approach as China, the Soviet Union fails. So the Soviet Union faces a lot of the same challenges as China, in some cases worse. Who's in charge of China during this time? Mikhail Gorbachev, and that's the man in the top right. He's got his signature bald head and this weird birthmark on his head. He is the general secretary of the Soviet Union. He oversaw the troubles that was facing the extremely weak superpower. There was a stagnating economy, declining patriotism, political instability in the Eastern European bloc countries, and crisis after crisis after crisis, like in Afghanistan, and worst of all, the Chernobyl disaster in Ukraine. The Chernobyl plant in nuclear silo number 4, nuclear reactor number 4, rather, I'm sorry, melting down, and it is the worst worst nuclear disaster in human history. But these are the things that Gorbachev are facing. Now, he is trying to address these problems by loosening the grip. I meant to put loosening, not losing the grip, but loosening the grip of the central government. And he were introduced 2 programs. And these 2 programs were perestroika and glasnost. Those are 2 Russian words. Glasnost was the opening of the movie industry, media, and others. Like, it was loosening the grip of the Soviet Union over ideas. That was the main thing with the glasnost, was the loosening up of freedom of speech. That's probably the best way to say it. This allowed people to be able to freely question the government, allow the sales of Bibles and Qurans, which was wholesale banned in the Soviet Union, and this allowed the return of churches and mosques, and it opened the door for democracy. Now, this would be the main thorn in the side of the Soviet Union, is that the free exchange of ideas would help lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Then we have perestroika, which was a failed program to save the economy of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev tried to open up the economy to foreign investors, but people outside of the Soviet Union were still very, very fearful of trying to invest in Russia. We did not believe that the USSR was allowing a free flow economy. We did not believe that. Soviet farmers were also very suspicious. They did not like the idea of going to private ownership. They thought that it was too risky. And so collective farming continued in Russia, and to the failure of Russia. And then rapid inflation. And so we get economic turmoil, political turmoil, and now more people being able to openly question the government. And so an extreme rarity happens across Russia: protests. Protests break out all across Russia against the Soviet system, against Gorbachev, against the Soviet Party, against the Communist Party. And many would call Gorbachev to send in the tanks like China. He did not. He chose not to. He decided to let glasnost and perestroika continue. And glasnost was working in Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe would see an event that no one thought was possible, and that was the destruction of the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall in 1989 would be dismantled by the citizens and the governments of Eastern and Western Germany, rather. And a mere 2 years later, the Soviet Union would collapse. And this shocked the world. This shocked everyone that the communist giant would fall. I remember my father talking about this while we were living in Japan, of that the Soviet Union was gone, that Russia was open. My dad was very, very, very excited. He always wanted to visit Russia. He always wanted to go to Moscow. He always wanted to go to St. Petersburg. And in 1992, if I remember correctly, no, it had to be a little bit later than that. I would think it was 1994 or 5. Yeah, right around there. Um, Russia opened itself up to the U.S. military, and my dad was on one of the first ships to go to Russia. So exciting. It was the only chance he was ever going to have to go to Russia. The only downside was is that he was going to miss Christmas. It was one of the only Christmases my dad ever missed. But we encouraged him to be able to go. We wanted my dad's dream to go to Russia to finally happen. But it was crushed. He was unable to leave the docks. The Russians were so suspicious of the American sailors that he never got to leave the dock. He was so lividly angry over this. But the Soviet Union was finally gone, and it was mostly thanks to Glasnost and the weakening of the Eastern Bloc that eventually the USSR would fall. And so capitalism would enter into Russia. And just to show you how impactful this was, this is me on the campus of Texas A&M University in College Station at the Bush College of Government. And that behind me is a piece of the Berlin Wall. It was so exciting for me to see that. I went to go visit the campus. I was visiting one of my friends there, Dr. David McIntyre. That's the man pictured in the top right here. That I was interviewing him while I was earning my master's degree for a paper. I interviewed him for a paper, and I still have that interview recorded. Unfortunately, Dr. McIntyre died in 2020. Very, very sad to hear that. He was actually a very, very good colleague to tap for geopolitical affairs. And so, if y'all want to see capitalism spreading in Russia, this is the first McDonald's that would open in Moscow. And people could not believe the efficiency of McDonald's in Russia. So, if y'all want to watch that, I highly recommend it. And this is a funny Pizza Hut commercial that Gorbachev actually is in. That Gorbachev, to try to get people to start accepting the new way of life in Russia, he would be in this Pizza Hut commercial. Please watch it. It's very funny because they actually capture the attitudes of the Russians during this time. Now, communism falls and the whole world breathes easy. The whole world says, finally, this mad is over. The world is now a safer, more stable place. We could not be more wrong. That despite the United States becoming the lone superpower and the Russian threat collapsing, the new world that would come after that actually becomes more unstable. That by all accounts, now we don't have one enemy anymore. It is no longer a world of United States versus Russia. It is no longer a world of East versus West. It is now a world of small factions, small radical factions springing up. And it's primarily extremist Muslim groups. And so now we no longer have just one super enemy, one state-sponsored enemy. We now, because once the world exited the frame of join the United States or join Russia, it was now more, what are we going to do for ourselves? And we get the threat of these non-state actors like the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram in Africa, and ISIS. And the world actually becomes more opaque. Who is the enemy now? Like, that is now the central question. And so, as a result of this destabilization, we get events like 9/11. That because Afghanistan was destabilized after the Soviets left and the United States did not invest or really help Afghanistan. I mean, we sponsored the Afghanistan Shah regime, but the Shah regime would go away in 1979, if I remember correctly, with the Afghan Civil War. Um, we lost control there. I'm thinking of Iran as well. I'm actually thinking of Iran, but Afghanistan would do the same thing. That would lead to the events of 9/11. We get the destabilization of Syria. We get the Syrian civil war in 2011, and that is a devastating war that's still going on now, with Bashar al-Assad being protected by Putin and the United States abandoning our allies with the Kurds. We get terrible pictures like this one. I really debated whether I wanted to show this picture or not. I can't tell you how much I hate this picture. I absolutely loathe this picture. Um, it brings up a lot of feelings, and I'm sorry to say. When the Syrian civil war happened, we get over 12 million refugees, like this poor 2-year-old boy. That these refugees, all they wanted to do was escape the horrors of Bashar al Assad. They wanted to escape the horrors of these extremist Muslim groups, and they would risk everything. They would risk everything to cross the Mediterranean to the European Union. This little baby, he would sell over with his family. They would risk everything. They bought their way with human traffickers because the world turned its back on these refugees. There was no real international aid for them. And so they risked everything, and this 2-year-old boy drowned on the shores of freedom. It's a very impactful picture. It woke us all up. I can't tell you how much I hate this picture. I really debated whether I should show y'all, but I thought it would dishonor Alan. That's his name. But this shows you guys the world is still a very chaotic place. We're in this wonderful bubble of the United States. And you know, this leads up to my final question as we come to a close. After this chapter, we're done. This is the last slide, y'all. That the opponent is no longer communism, but it's repressive systems based on religion, ethnicity, and nationality. And as the United States is the lone superpower in the world, here's some key questions you need to ask yourselves. And I encourage you guys, please ask these questions, because now this is the world you live in. This is the world that you guys are going to have to navigate. That once y'all leave my classroom, once you leave Crandall High School, this is the world that you're going to be entering. And you got to ask yourselves these questions. I think this is a really good, serious question. Did the Cold War really end, or did it just pause? And here's another very good question. I cannot answer this for y'all. This is a question that you're going to have to determine based on your morality, whether that's based on religion or secularism, based on your political views. I can't tell you guys this. And I hope that based on the education you received in my classroom, you have a clearer view of the world, and you have a clear view of how you feel about the world. Can the United States continue to lead the world in democracy and freedom? And if I can be so bold to pose this question, because we should answer this question too. It's probably even better. Should the United States lead it? And we can see, based on these pictures here, what happens when the United States decides to let go. That the question that we need to pose now is, should the United States lead democracy in China? I mean, not China, but Taiwan. Should we lead democracy in Africa against Boko Haram? Should we lead democracy in Syria and prevent other children from meeting the fate of Alan? I can't help but look at this picture and see my son laying on that beach. And even right now, I want to go to him while he's asleep with my wife and give him a hug. because we got to ask ourselves, if the United States did more, would Alan still be here? Would those planes have hit our towers? Would have those girls in Africa been kidnapped by Boko Haram? So I'll leave y'all with these questions of what role in the world does the United States have? And I suppose I'll end it with this question for y'all, and this will be my final thing for this video. What role do you have in the world?